It was then that Salazar asked if Rogers wanted him to take the pace. For Rogers, it was the final blow. He was done. The race was Salazar's. Take it, it's yours, he said. But that was the last he saw of the runner. Rather than pulling in front, Salazar began to wobble like a car whose driver had died at the wheel. Roke passed him. Then Virgin passed him. Spectators watched him weave across the rows. He dropped to 5th place, then 6th, 7th, 8th. There was something seriously wrong, but no one knew how to respond. He was literally losing consciousness as his legs motored him forward. His brain could no longer tell his body what to do. Up ahead, Rogers was lengthening his lead. With his last challenger gone, he coasted easily past the marina and made his final turn toward the ball field. He acknowledged the crowd with a quick smile and a wave of the hand. Victory was sweet, but sweeter still was the knowledge that he was still the king. Somehow Salazar managed to make the final hill in Falmouth Heights, but as he crossed the finish line, he collapsed. They carried him to the medical tent, where his core body temperature was measured at 108 degrees. Medical personnel worked furiously to revive him. They dumped him in ice water to cool him down. His father showed up, hot-headed and panicked. Runners continued to cross the finish line, but Alberto Salazar lay semi-conscious in a plastic tub filled with ice, moaning, thrashing, and cursing. His brain was simply another body part, valuable and weak. He had failed, and he lay broken in defeat. Now, a priest touched his forehead. His father gripped his hand. The young athlete hovered on the knife edge of darkness. At the height of the running boom, it appeared the future had ended before it began. So that is one of the opening paragraphs of a great book called Kings of the Road by Cameron Stracher. I actually lost the jacket cover, but I'll put a picture of it. It's a great book. And it's one of those books that a lot of traditional running books are more about. They are training books or they're biographies of runners. Those are kind of the two main genres that you find in a book. But what's great about this particular book is that it's more of a history book. And in particular, it's a history book of what the author talks about being the American running boom that happened between the 1970s and the 1980s, specifically 1972 to 1982. And what it does is that it's a great book that talks about how that decade was kind of the height of American running. This is when three of the greatest Americans in the history of marathon running, road running, Bill Rogers, Frank Shorter, and Alberto Salazar were really doing all the big things they're doing. This is when these guys were winning the Boston Marathon, winning the Olympic Marathon, running the New York City Marathon. And he talks a lot about how this was the heyday of that period, and then nothing's really happened since then. And in particular, the way the book's laid out is that it's unique in the sense that it's centered around a really famous road race, which happens, I guess, right around August, beginning of August every year in Cape Cod, and it's the Falmouth Road Race. It's a little over 7 miles, so kind of an odd distance. It started back in the 1970s, and the book talks about it. It talks about using this particular road race as a place where all these great champions came, and how for a period of 10 years they dominated on this road race, but also around the world, and then how slowly after that Americans weren't that dominant anymore. That becomes the centerpiece of the story. And what's great about this book is there's all these really rich mini history lessons and stories that are scattered throughout that are interesting. So for instance, one of the really good ones is, it starts in 1972, and it starts with the Olympics, which are happening in Munich at the time. And in this Olympic Games, this is when Frank Shorter, famous American distance runner, was a contemporary of Steve Prefontaine, University of Florida, super successful runner, and to date is the last American to have won the Olympic gold in the marathon. And so this particular story it's talking about the Munich Games in 1972. And what's really great about it is it talks about how, Shorter's running the marathon. He has pulled the lead. He's going towards the end. and the last lap of the marathon is actually inside the track. And so we'll pick up the book here. It says, "Up ahead was the stadium, concrete and steel in the dusk. As he approached the tunnel that led beneath and onto the track, he heard a huge explosion of cheers. He was momentarily confused. What could it be? The high jump? A world record? But then he was inside the tunnel and cocooned in silence. It was a signature moment in the Olympic Games for him, the one he would remember for years to come. The tunnel symbolizing the end of the marathon. When he finally emerged into the track, he heard silence. That was odd, he thought, but he ignored it and began to sprint to the finish. As he did, the silence turned to catcalls and boos. It appeared that the hometown crowd was belittling the Americans' victory. In fact, they were protesting the removal of a German student, Norbert Schulhaus, who had jumped to the marathon right before the finish. Incredible, considering the terrorist attacks and the additional security precautions taken by the Germans. With his running shorts, singlet, and muscular build, Schulhaus had fooled the crowd into thinking the German was about to win the race. In the announcer's booth, Eric Siegel shouted, "That's not Frank, that's not Frank, it's an imposter. Get that guy off the track. How can this happen at the Olympic Games? It's Bush League. Get rid of that guy. There's Frank Shorter, there's Frank. Come on, Frank, you won it." So really, really interesting story, and it's a cool video to watch if you go on YouTube. But, like I mentioned, the setup, you have this guy who basically jumped onto the track ahead of time and was doing the victory lap around the Olympic Stadium. Everybody thought that the German, in the host country, Germany, won the Olympics. And then here comes Frank, who just got done running, 20, little less than 26 miles, about to do his last 400 meters, and he enters expecting people to be cheering and screaming, and it's not. They're actually booing him because, they thought that the German guy had got to take it. So really rich history, and it's super cool how he went and dug a lot of these different type of things up. There's also a lot of good stuff in here about what I consider two of the best marathons in the world. So if you guys are fans of the Boston Marathon, this is a book that has really spent a lot of time thinking about the beginning of that race and some of the great champions that have won the race over time. And so in particular, there's a lot of good stories about Bill Rogers and his opportunities when he went and ran a lot of the different marathons. And so here is a good story of the time of 1975. And this is, I think, maybe the second or third time Bill Rogers had run the Boston Marathon, being a local Boston native. And here's a little bit of that story. When Rogers awoke on that morning of the 79th running of the Boston Marathon, so 79th running of the Boston Marathon, and this is in 1975, so it's pretty cool how old and historic that marathon is. And anytime you can read a book and it has all these rich stories scattered throughout, and this is just one example of the different stories and the champions of the Boston Marathon, it's a really cool read, and it's inspiring as a runner. So what he talked about is the weather that morning was for Goldilocks, neither too hot nor too cold. There was a nice tailwind on the course and the chill in the air, perfect. Rogers laced up the Nike Bosses that Prefontaine had sent to him, as in Steve Prefontaine, and slipped on a white t-shirt. His girlfriend had used a magic marker to write GBTC on the front of the shirt, Greater Boston Track Club. The race was not until noon, so he had pancakes for breakfast and read the morning papers. He had run the course 100 times and taken apart with Coach Squires about as often, but his strategy was simple. He intended to go like a bat out of hell and never stop or look back. And that is exactly what he did. He goes through the course around the 15-kilometer mark. He's down to a couple people. He heard a spectator cheering for Drayton, and it really made him mad. A Boston spectator rooting for a Canadian, so he poured it on. By the time Rogers hit the series of climbs on his Heartbreak Hill, he was alone in front. His new shoes came loose, and he stopped once to tie them. He also stopped 4 times to drink water because, as he explained, he couldn't drink and run at the same time. This amazed spectators and the media who couldn't believe the leader would simply come to a complete stop 5 times during a race. Nevertheless, he broke Ron Hill's course record by 35 seconds and Frank Shorter's U.S. record by the same amount, becoming the first American to run under 2:10 in the marathon. His time of 2:09:55 was the fifth fastest marathon time in the world ever. So really, a remarkable story. And I think what's really interesting about this is that this was 1975. This is the story of an American runner running under 2 hours and 10 minutes in a marathon, which is, phenomenal. Especially phenomenal as we look at, just the sake of marathon running today. And I really love the details around, you watch the marathons today, and the elite athletes really have it down to science, grabbing the water bottles off the table, eating. And here's a guy who is stopping at the tables 4 times to drink water because he couldn't drink and run at the same time. And, it's kind of interesting. I had the exact same experience a lot. It's neat to know that here's a guy who ran a 2:09 marathon, and, he stopped. It wasn't a particularly big deal. So really cool. A lot of great stories about the Boston Marathon gathered throughout here. There's also some really good ones about when Alberto Salazar, I think in the 1980s, did his famous duel in the sun with Dick Beardsley, and also just captures a lot of the magic that go into that story, and then these two guys that are running in on the iconic kind of Boston Marathon course. The other really interesting theme in this book, aside from these mini histories, these mini biographies of 3 people, the development of Boston Marathon, is that it really is set during the time when the New York City Marathon, which has now become a very huge, big, significant, substantial marathon, really started to develop and take root. And there's a passage in here which talks about the development of the New York City Marathon, which is something I hadn't really known that much about, which, I'll read a brief passage about it, but there's, a full chapter 2 dedicated to development of the marathon. But basically, the inaugural race, being the New York City Marathon, was held on September 13, 1970. So, in comparison, remember the Boston Marathon started early, it was 75 years ago, and so, I guess late 1800s. This is a race that started, almost 70 years later, the New York City Marathon. So the first one was held in 1970. Not a resounding success. The temperature was 80 degrees at the start. There were more pushcart salesmen than spectators. As runners passed, the salesman yelled, "What's the big rush? Stopping by a pretzel already." 107 people, including 2 women, paid $1 enter, but only 55 finished. A New York firefighter, Gary Murky, who had worked a full shift the night before, won in 2:31:39. So, pretty cool. That's back when the New York City Marathon used to be just a series of laps around Central Park. And so the story goes on to talk about how around 1975, a gentleman, George Spitz, a city auditor and runner, not only proposed that the race transverse all 5 boroughs in honor of the nation's bicentennial. At first, the idea of shutting down city streets for an amateur athletic competition gave Frank Lebo, who was the famous New York Roadrunners head, who will become associated with the New York City Marathon, and gave him conniptions. He thought the cost of a 5-borough marathon would be prohibitive and the logistics daunting, to say nothing of the personal dangers. A killer named Son of Sam was on the loose, and the streets were not safe for children and other living things. Times Square is not the Disneyland playground it is today, but the seedy home of prostitutes and thugs. Residents carried extra cash in their wallets so the muggers would not shoot or knife them. As the New York Daily News columnist Jim Dyer wrote, City Hall was bankrupt, business was fleeing, the Bronx was burning. However, this guy was not undaunted. He basically convinced the city that he would do it, and as a result, beginning in 1975 is when they started the idea of actually having the 5-borough course, which is what the course looks like today. Really interesting, starting in Staten Island and slowly traversing through all the 5 courses in the New York City Marathon. So it's neat. The book talks a lot about the development of that race, and if you're interested, it goes into good details about how they attracted elite runners, how the marketing schemes work behind all that, and how it kind of all pulled together. So another really interesting thread that goes into that. And the last story I'll read in there is in association with this was, the year was 1980. So now we're talking about almost 10 years after the New York City Marathon started. Alberto Salazar is in its prime. It's reaching the end of the decade of the American running boom. And this is when Alberto Salazar decides to run the race. And before he runs the race, he makes this prediction that he is going to basically smash the American record. And he does. And so the way it ends is, around the park and up the hill by tavern on the green, Salazar was all alone and running like a man possessed. He broke the tape in 2:09:41, eclipsing Rogers' course record by 28 seconds, and ran the second fastest marathon ever by an American, and the fastest first marathon by anyone. So this was his first marathon, came across in 2:09:41. Gomez finished second, followed by Graham, Jeff Wills of Texas, and then Rogers, who finished in 2:13:21. So really interesting, reading about the beginning of Alberto Salazar, who obviously has gone on to an amazing running career, now a coaching career. But you really get a glimpse of how he started in this book. And, the last thing that I'll mention before we go to the conclusion is, although the book is primarily focused on the history of a lot of these mini stories, there are some kind of interesting lore and legends in here. And a couple of them that I thought were kind of interesting is it talks about back in the day how when coaches were, when you're at a race and you're trying to track times and who won the race at the very end of it, the way they would do it is, if a single runner was missed, it screwed up the entire count. In that case, according to a local newspaper, a volunteer with a high-tech device known as a tape recorder would stand at the end of the chute and say the numbers of runners into the tape. So that's how they did it, right? You would have someone basically down there, and as the runners came through, they would read the numbers off, and that is how they knew the different orders in the finish. And there's a bunch of little interesting anecdotes like that throughout here. Another one I thought was kind of interesting was, it's almost a psychoanalysis of who becomes distance runners. And, I think even based upon personal experience, and maybe you relate to this, I think this is pretty spot on. So the book talks about, despite their differences, the two men shared certain characteristics common among distance runners: asceticism, introversion, and neurosis. You could not run mile after mile at sub 5-minute pace, or whatever pace, without a bizarre dedication to self-abnegation. Even now, distance running has yet to produce the equivalent of Usain Bolt parading around the stadium with his finger in the air. Instead, runners tend to save their celebrations for the bar after the award ceremony, which I think is as true as it was in the 1970s as it is true today. So let me conclude and wrap this up with basically saying I think this is a book that is definitely recommended buy. Especially if you're looking to learn more about the history of running and in the process get inspired towards, just a lot of the roots that a lot of these big events have into them, and understanding all the famous footprints that have run across them. But to end with, I think this is a really good passage in the book that the author ends with. And what it talks about is, so here we go. Indeed, since Salazar's victories in 1982, only one American man has won Falmouth, and no American-born man has won a marathon in the New York City, Boston, Chicago, or Los Angeles, or any other major distance race. Meb Keflezighi, who immigrated from Eritrea to the United States when he was 13, won New York in 2010. No American-born male distance runner has been ranked first in any event, and none has taken home an Olympic gold medal. Only one American, Ryan Hall, has ever ran faster than Salazar's marathon time of 2:08:13, and none has ever matched his course record at Falmouth. So, pretty interesting stuff. The book does conclude with mentioning that today men such as Rupp, Manzano, and Ryan Hall, also coached by Salazar, and women such as Shalane Flanagan and Carrie Goucher are competing internationally with the best of the world, but there's a lot of ground to make up. The first step is to create more initial at the Oregon Distance Project, etc., etc., etc. Pretty telling, pretty interesting. The book concludes that they do think these athletes are on the right track and they have promise. This was written in 2013, and since then, as we know, it's coming to true with Galen's performance in Chicago, in Amsterdam, as well as Shalane's performance in Boston, Desi's performance in Boston. Shalane's performance in New York, and it does kind of make us think that after the 1970 decade, where American running boom was taking off, maybe now there actually is an opportunity for a lot of the American runners and these projects to start paying off again. So again, great book, highly recommended by Kings of the Road. Super great history around, what it means to be a marathon runner, the trials and tribulations these guys have gone through to pave the way for sport, which is pretty ubiquitous today. And great read, highly recommend it. And as always, see you at the finish line.